Good evening, everyone, and welcome back. Now, we'll explore how neural networks power GANs and why they are reshaping generative models in deep learning. Put simply, two intelligent programs team up to create new, realistic data. The generator proposes fresh outputs while the discriminator judges whether they look real. With this dialogue, they push each other to improve, producing convincing images, sounds, and more. All of this runs on deep learning techniques. By the end, you'll see where GANs fit in the broader landscape of artificial intelligence and creative technology, and why researchers are excited about this direction. Today, we'll explore generative adversarial networks, or GANs. We start with two players, a generator that creates data and a discriminator that spots fakes. They play a game and improve together. Then we'll peek under the hood at the networks powering GANs, how the pieces fit from input to output. We'll cover training basics, what loss means, and how we keep learning stable as the two parts co-evolve. We'll see how the size and shape of networks affect speed, quality, and reliability, and a few tricks researchers use to smooth learning. We'll discuss common design challenges like instability, mode collapse, and overfitting, and how people address them. We'll also touch on specialized GAN variants and what the future might hold for this field. From here, we step into the heart of GANs, a dynamic pair of learners that push each other toward realism. Think of a generator trying to cook up convincing images from a splash of randomness, and a discriminator acting as a careful judge who decides what looks real and what doesn't. Their back and forth adversarial training turns feedback into sharper outputs. In the upcoming sections, we'll unpack the neural network building blocks that make this possible: layers, neurons, and the way information flows from input to output, plus activation choices that keep learning versatile. You'll see how the generator and discriminator are trained together using backpropagation and gradient descent, aiming to minimize an adversarial loss. We'll also discuss practical hurdles like overfitting and stabilization tricks, such as regularization, and then survey the practical uses: realistic image and video synthesis, data augmentation, style transfer, and anomaly detection, with notes on safety and ethics. Let me take this a step further and connect the core idea of GANs to three practical strands that researchers routinely optimize: stability, evaluation, and integration with complementary models. First, stability and regularization. In modern GAN practice, the discriminator's behavior matters as much as the generator's ambition. One key technique is spectral normalization, which constrains the spectral norm of each weight matrix in the discriminator. Intuitively, this caps how strongly the discriminator can amplify small input changes, helping keep gradients well behaved for the generator. It's a principled way to impose a Lipschitz-like constraint without resorting to crude clipping. Alongside spectral normalization, gradient penalties have become standard. The Wasserstein GAN with gradient penalty enforces a soft Lipschitz condition by penalizing deviations of the discriminator's gradient from unit norm on samples along real-fake interpolations. This shifts the training dynamics away from abrupt explosions and towards smoother, more interpretable updates. There are related penalties, like R1 divided by R2 regularization on real or fake samples, that further stabilize training in practice. Taken together, these tools enable more reliable convergence and sharper results, especially on complex, high-resolution data. Second, evaluation metrics to quantify progress. The Freshet Inception Distance, or FID, has become a workhorse metric. It compares the distributions of real and generated images in a high-level feature space, typically using an inception network, by measuring the Freshet distance between their means and covariances. Lower FID signals both quality and diversity improvements. It's valuable because it captures more than pixel-level similarity, but it's not perfect. FID can be sensitive to dataset shifts and the choice of feature extractor. Complementary metrics like kernel inception distance, KD, provide an unbiased estimate using MMD in the same feature space, and precision recall analysis for generative models help diagnose mode coverage versus fidelity. In practice, researchers track a small set of complementary metrics to avoid over-interpreting a single score and to diagnose specific failure modes like mode collapse or mode dropping. Third, hybrid and complementary models. Hybrid architectures fuse the strengths of different paradigms. Examples include VAE GAN hybrids that couple a variational encoder with an adversarial decoder to obtain both sharp samples and latent structure, or BiGAN divided by ALI frameworks that learn an encoder jointly with the generator for bidirectional mappings. InfoGAN introduces structured latent variables by maximizing mutual information, promoting disentangled representations. Conditional GANs and image-to-image translation setups A, G, PICs, 2 PICs. CycleGAN demonstrate how conditioning and cross-domain mappings can be integrated into the adversarial framework. More recently, hybridizations with diffusion models or normalizing flows offer routes to combine sample quality with tractable likelihoods. These approaches illustrate a broader design space. Use GANs to achieve realism while leveraging complementary models to provide interpretability, stability, or controllability. Having laid out the foundational structure, we now turn to stability, evaluation, and smarter modeling strategies that push GANs from toy demonstrations toward robust research tools. First, consider regularization and constraints that keep training stable as networks grow deeper and data complexity increases. Spectral normalization is a widely adopted technique. We constrain each weight matrix in the discriminator by its spectral norm. This effectively bounds the Lipschitz constant of the discriminator, which dampens extreme updates and helps the generator receive more reliable gradients. It's lightweight to implement and plays nicely with deep architectures, often reducing mode collapse and improving convergence without sacrificing sample quality. Alongside spectral normalization, gradient penalties offer a principled path to stability. The gradient penalty used in WGAN-GP enforces that the discriminator's gradients have unit norm on interpolations between real and fake samples. This relaxes the strict weight clipping that earlier Wasserstein GAN variants required, yielding smoother training dynamics and better generalization of the discriminator's decision boundary. Together, these tools shift the optimization landscape from brittle adversarial games to more predictable, monotone learning progress. We also pay attention to update dynamics. The two timescale update rule, or TTUR, recommends using different learning rates and sometimes optimizers for the generator and discriminator. In practice, a slightly smaller or differently scheduled learning rate for the generator can prevent the discriminator from overpowering the generator early on, delays mode, collapse, and often yields better quality samples at similar training budgets. Turning to evaluation and diagnostics, quantitative metrics matter as much as qualitative inspection. Freshet inception distance, FID, remains a leading benchmark. It compares the statistics of real and generated features in a deep network's embedding space, offering a proxy for both fidelity and diversity. However, FID is not without limitations. Sample size, resolution, and domain shifts all influence its value, so it should be complemented with additional measures. Inception score provides another view but has its own blind spots. Perceptual metrics such as LPIPS can quantify perceptual similarity between images beyond pixel-wise differences. Recently, precision and recall for generative models offer a nuanced view of fidelity, precision, versus coverage recall of the target distribution, which helps diagnose mode dropping or overgeneralization. Finally, hybrid models can leverage complementary strengths. GAN-VAE hybrids marry latent space structure with adversarial sharpening, enabling explicit encoders for efficient inference and interpolation. Conditional GANs provide controllability and can stabilize training by anchoring generation to auxiliary information. Moreover, incorporating reconstruction losses or perceptual losses alongside the adversarial objective often yields more reliable optimization and better downstream utility. In short, modern GAN research blends stability techniques like spectral normalization and gradient penalties, robust evaluation suites, and hybrid modeling to push toward reliable, scalable generative modeling across domains. Thank you. Building on the two-network view, I'd like to shift from the mechanics of adversarial training to how researchers stabilize, evaluate, and extend GANs in contemporary work. The goal is not just to produce convincing samples, but to do so consistently, interpretably, and at scale. First, stability and regularization. A key line of attack is to control the discriminator's capacity and the geometry of the learning problem. Spectral normalization constrains the spectral norm of the discriminator's weight matrices, effectively limiting the Lipschitz constant. This simple adjustment reduces training oscillations and helps the generator learn smoother, more interpretable mappings. Another cornerstone is gradient penalties, exemplified by the Wasserstein GAN with gradient penalty. By encouraging the gradient norm of the critic to stay close to one-on interpolations between real and fake samples, we obtain smoother gradients, better gradient flow, and more reliable mode coverage. Taken together, these techniques address a core tension. Powerful discriminators can overpower generators, but if you tame the discriminator's response, the generator receives more informative, well-behaved feedback. Second, how we measure success. Traditional qualitative assessments are complemented by quantitative metrics. The Fréchet inception distance (FID) has become a standard benchmark. It compares the statistics of generated and real samples in a learned feature space, typically indicating both realism and diversity. Inception score (IS) remains informative for certain settings, but can be misleading when seen in isolation. Researchers increasingly report a suite of metrics, including precision divided by recall for generative models and distributional coverage measures, to gauge both the quality and the span of the generated data. Importantly, metric interpretation should be contextual. FID's value depends on dataset, resolution, and the nature of the generated class distribution. Third, moving beyond vanilla GANs. Hybrid and architectural innovations push capabilities further. Conditional GANs introduce labels or text descriptions to steer generation, enabling targeted synthesis and controllable editing. Style-based generators, such as StyleGAN and its successors, use adaptive instance normalization to separate content from style, delivering high-fidelity, controllable visuals with impressive disentanglement. Progressive growing strategies add resolution gradually, stabilizing training and enabling finer detail. And across these trends, researchers explore combinations with other paradigms e.g. VAE GAN hybrids or diffusion-inspired ideas to blend strengths and mitigate weaknesses. In short, advancing GANs today means pairing strong stability techniques with robust evaluation, while embracing architectural innovations that grant controllability and scale. This trio, stability, measurement, and architectural ambition, drives reliable, high-quality generative research across domains. As we move on, the spotlight shifts from what the generator can do to how the two halves of a GAN talk to each other. We'll unpack how the generator crafts images step-by-step convolutional foundations, upsampling choices, and the role of activations and normalization in keeping things stable once random inputs wake up to a picture. Then we turn to the critic, the discriminator's deeper CNNs, its use of dropout and regularization to stay honest, and how a binary verdict guides the generator to improve. You'll hear about how the two models form a feedback loop, with law signals driving alternating updates, and how depth and regularization shape learning. Finally, we'll discuss real-world training challenges, mode, collapse, oscillations, and the design knobs that help maintain balance for steadier, more realistic outputs. In the next slides, we'll see these ideas in action. Now, moving beyond the basic blocks, we turn to how a generator is crafted to deliver not just plausible textures, but globally coherent scenes. The core toolkit remains two pillars: convolutional layers to encode spatial hierarchies and transposed convolutions to synthesize higher resolution outputs. But the power comes from how we arrange them, how we normalize, and how we drive the process with stable, informative signals. First, upsampling and its pitfalls. Transposed convolutions are learnable upsampling, but they can introduce artifacts such as checkerboard patterns. A modern practice is to pair a resize operation, nearest neighbor or bilinear, with a subsequent convolution, or to use sub-pixel pixel shuffle upsampling. These choices influence texture, continuity, and speed. Multiscale discriminators also help. Having discriminators that examine the image at multiple resolutions guides the generator to maintain both fine-grained detail and global structure. Second, activation functions and normalization. ReLU variants are common in hidden layers, with leaky ReLU often preferred to avoid dead units. The final layer typically uses TAN to bound the output. Normalization is a lever for training stability. Batch normalization helps gradients flow but can introduce batch dependencies at inference. Alternatives such as instance norm or layer norm can be advantageous, especially in conditional or style transfer settings. A more recent stabilization technique is spectral normalization, usually applied to the discriminator but sometimes extended to the generator. By constraining the spectral norm of weight matrices, we can temper excessively aggressive updates and promote steadier learning dynamics. Third, stability through penalties and constraints. Gradient penalties, most famously the WGAN GP objective, enforce Lipschitz constraints on the discriminator, which in practice reduces mode collapse and yields more informative gradients for the generator. A spectral normalization provides a complementary architecture-level constraint. Combined, these tools can dramatically improve convergence and sample quality, particularly on challenging datasets with diverse textures. Fourth, evaluation and iteration. It's essential to quantify progress with metrics that reflect both realism and diversity. Frechet inception distance fit is a go-to. Lower scores indicate generated distributions closer to real data in feature space. Sometimes inception score IS is reported, but it can be less informative about diversity. Precision and recall for generative models or recent class conditional metrics help diagnose mode collapse versus coverage. When tuning the generator, these metrics guide which architectural tweaks, normalization choice, upsampling method, or the use of multi-scale critics actually move the needle. Fifth, hybrid and advanced directions. Hybrid models, such as VAE GANs or diffusion-guided GANs, can blend strong likelihood estimates with adversarial realism. Multiscale and attention-enhanced generators, for example, incorporating self-attention modules, help maintain coherence in large scenes. The takeaway is that generator design is a balance: texture, fidelity, global structure, training stability, and reliable evaluation. By integrating these advanced tools, researchers can push generators from plausible to convincingly real. Discriminator design is not just a deeper net with more capacity. It's a set of principled choices that shape the feedback signal the generator receives. Beyond the intuitive idea that CNNs reveal edges and textures, we can tighten and calibrate the discriminator so that its judgments are informative without overwhelming the generator or collapsing training. One key advance is spectral normalization. By constraining the spectral largest singular value norm of each weight matrix in the discriminator, we cap the Lipschitz constant of D. This stabilizes gradients fed back to the generator, prevents the discriminator from becoming too confident too quickly, and helps maintain a balanced two-player game. In practice, spectral normalization often yields more stable convergence, especially when using very deep or multi-scale discriminators that keep pushing for finer details. Another major refinement is the use of gradient penalties. In Wasserstein-based formulations, WGAN and its variants, a gradient penalty term enforces a soft Lipschitz constraint by penalizing deviations of the gradient norm from one with respect to inputs. This makes training less brittle than weight clipping and generally improves both realism and diversity of generated images. The hinge loss is another robust alternative for the discriminator, encouraging a margin between real and fake scores while remaining stable in practice. Architecturally, discriminators can be tuned beyond a single global pass. Patch-GAN discriminators, which classify small image patches as real or fake, excel at capturing high-frequency textures and local consistency. Multi-scale discriminators, or hybrids that combine global and local judgments, provide complementary signals. Global coherence, scene structure, object relationships, and local fidelity, textures, edges. These designs let the discriminator scrutinize both what and how an image looks. Evaluation metrics are essential for diagnosing progress. The Frechet inception distance (FID) remains a leading quantitative proxy for image quality and diversity, comparing real and generated distributions in a learned feature space. However, FID has limitations, particularly when domains shift from the ImageNet-like data the inception features were trained on. Complementary metrics like kernel, inception, distance KID, and human studies, plus task-specific measures, give a fuller picture of progress and generalization. Hybrid models add indirect supervision to the discriminator. Conditioning the D on class labels A, C, G, A, N style or auxiliary tasks can stabilize training and encourage richer representations. Some approaches couple a reconstruction objective or an energy-based term to D, providing additional gradients that guide the generator toward visually and semantically plausible outputs. In this slide, we dig into how modern GANs balance differences and interactions between the networks, moving beyond the basics to the engineering choices that shape training dynamics and outcomes. The theme is symmetry and asymmetry are not just stylistic, they encode function, capacity, and feedback. Architectural symmetry versus asymmetry. Today's designs often share a common feature: backbone convolution layers, skip connections, and learned representations, yet they diverge in purpose driven ways. The generator tends to broaden its capacity in later stages to synthesize diverse high frequency details, while the discriminator frequently adopts greater depth or multi scale structure to reliably detect subtle artifacts across resolutions. This mix enables each network to specialize without losing a shared sensory language of features. Advanced stabilizers enter here. Spectral normalization applied to the discriminator constrains spectral norms of weight matrices, stabilizing the gradient magnitudes that flow back to the generator. Gradient penalties, such as those in WGA-NGP, enforce Lipschitz continuity and reduce erratic updates, further smoothing the learning path. Multi-scale or multi-branch discriminators, sometimes with projection discriminators for conditioning, help the two networks attend to artifacts at different granularities. Loss signals and information exchange. The back and forth is steered by adversarial losses, but we now deploy refined tools to shape that dialogue. The discriminator provides a real versus fake feedback signal. When it starts to falter, the generator receives a stronger incentive to improve. Conversely, the generator's objective to fool the discriminator translates into meaningful gradient signals that drive the discriminator to adapt. Beyond the canonical minimax losses, practical implementations employ hinge losses, non-saturating variance, and gradient penalties that influence the speed and direction of learning. The design choice of how fast each network trains relative to the other, what researchers call the two timescale update rule, can dramatically affect convergence, stability, and the diversity of generated samples. Evaluation metrics enter the scene here as well. Freshet inception distance and inception score quantify realism and diversity, guiding hyperparameter tuning and early stopping, but they must be interpreted with dataset and model context in mind. Stability challenges and hybrid horizons. Mode collapse, oscillations, and fragile convergence remain central concerns. Remedies include not only penalties and normalization, but architectural tricks like conditional or projection discriminators, careful capacity balancing, and sometimes hybrid models that blend GANs with VAEs or diffusion-like components. Hybrid frameworks can combine the sharpness of adversarial training with the representational guarantees of probabilistic priors, offering improved coverage of data modes. Next, we pull back the curtain on how GANs learn to produce realistic data. We'll start with adversarial loss, the tug of war between generator and discriminator, and why balance matters. You'll hear how loss designs like Wasserstein or Hinge can steady training and keep gradients meaningful. Then we shift to gradient flow and stabilization techniques, gradient penalties, learning rate schedules, and batch normalization that keep updates sane and help avoid mode collapse. We'll connect these ideas to a practical training loop and show how to monitor losses and visuals so neither side runs away. Then we zoom into optimization choices. Adam and RMS prop tune learning rates on the fly, while scheduling the pace of learning prevents surprise jumps. We'll cover smart weight initialization, Xavier or He methods, and how a solid starting point helps adversarial learning. ADV adversarial loss remains the engines that drive GANs, but the practical path to reliable generation is to pair it with stabilizing techniques and robust evaluation. In contemporary practice, we don't rely on the loss alone to guide learning. We shape the optimization landscape so gradients remain meaningful and updates stay balanced across training phases. A foundational stability aid is spectral normalization. By constraining the spectral norm of the discriminator's weight matrices, we enforce a controlled Lipschitz constant. This keeps the discriminator from becoming excessively sharp and producing exploitative gradients, which in turn prevents the generator from chasing brittle signals. Spectral normalization is lightweight to implement and pairs well with a variety of architectures, helping to preserve training dynamics without onerous tuning. Gradient penalties offer another principled route. In the Wasserstein framework, a gradient penalty on interpolations between real and fake samples enforces a near one Lipschitz constraint, yielding more informative gradients when the discriminator is strong. This WGA-NGP approach mitigates gradient vanishing and reduces mode collapse, often yielding steadier convergence than vanilla adversarial losses. Related regularizers like R1 divided by R2 penalties apply to real or fake samples to temper the discriminator's curvature. These penalties tend to damp oscillations and enable more predictable generator progress, but require careful weighting to avoid oversmoothing signals. When selecting losses, it helps to think in terms of gradient quality and convergence behavior. Wasserstein loss with gradient penalties and hinge loss for the discriminator are among the most influential alternatives because they produce clearer, more stable feedback than standard log loss. Keep in mind that no single loss is universally best. The goal is to choose a regime that preserves informative gradients as the generator improves. Evolution matters as much as training. Fresheth inception, distance FID, has become a standard for gauging both realism and diversity by comparing statistics of real and generated features in a deep perceptual space. It's important to report multiple metrics: FID inception score, and, when possible, human judgments, since each has biases. For small sample sizes or domain shifts, interpret metrics with caution and complement them with qualitative assessments and task-relevant criteria. Hybrid models and architectural enhancements offer further gains. Encoder-augmented GANs, BGAN divided by ALI, enable joint representation learning. Energy-based or cycle-consistent variants can enforce meaningful structure in the latent or image space. In large-scale settings, class conditioning, as in BGAN, and perceptual guidance e.g. clip-based supervision demonstrate how architectural choices and auxiliary losses can work with adversarial training to produce higher fidelity samples. In short, adversarial loss is the catalyst, but stability and evaluation are the scaffolding. Combine principled regularizers, sensible update schedules, and robust metrics to move from flashy gains to dependable, publishable improvements. Let's deepen our look at gradient flow by connecting the mechanics you've seen with practical stabilization recipes that researchers now rely on to push GANs from fragile curiosities to reliable tools. First, consider the role of the discriminator's capacity in shaping the gradient signal. Spectral normalization is a widely adopted technique that constrains the Lipschitz constant of the discriminator by limiting the spectral norm of its weight matrices. By keeping those norms in check, we tame potential spikes in gradient magnitudes that would otherwise push updates erratically. The net effect is a more predictable backpropagation signal for the generator, which translates into smoother convergence trajectories and reduced likelihood of destabilizing oscillations. Second, gradient penalties provide a direct regularization of the learning signal. The WGN-GP approach, for instance, introduces a penalty on the gradient norm of the discriminator with respect to inputs evaluated along interpolations between real and fake samples. This nudges the discriminator toward a unit gradient regime where it matters most, mitigating both vanishing and exploding gradients across training steps. Variants like R1 and R2 penalties extend this idea by penalizing gradient norms on real or fake data, respectively. In practice, these penalties restrain the discriminator from becoming overly confident and ensure the generator receives informative, well-behaved gradients. Third, balance the update cadence of the two networks is less than #0. 5 hash is greater than the 2 timescale update rule that recognizes that the generator and discriminator often require different learning rates to maintain a healthy gradient flow. Using, for example, a smaller step size for the discriminator or a slightly larger one for the generator can prevent one network from overpowering the other and keep the gradient signal from collapsing into a single dominant pathway. Evaluation and diagnostics come into play here as well. Metrics such as Frechet inception distance, FID, and inception score quantify realism and diversity of outputs and act as practical proxies for the quality of gradient flow during training. When FID stalls or worsens, it's often a signal to recondition the gradient landscape via penalties, normalization choices, or architectural tweaks. Hybrid approaches also offer leverage. Multi-scale discriminators, feature matching losses, and occasional reconstruction or energy-based components can complement the adversarial objective, guiding the gradient flow through auxiliary channels and reducing the risk of mode collapse. Practically, these ideas translate into a disciplined training loop. Monitor gradient norms, apply penalties when norms drift, adjust learning rates with TTUR, and verify progress with robust metrics. The upshot is a more reliable, interpretable pathway for updates, yielding stable training and higher quality images in less uncertain wanderings through the parameter space. Building on the GAN basics, today I want to unpack optimization and evaluation strategies that keep the training dynamics healthy, stable, and ultimately credible to researchers and practitioners alike. A key tool in stabilizing the discriminator is spectral normalization. By constraining the Lipschitz constant of the discriminator network, spectral normalization dampens aggressive gradient flows that can send the generator off track. It's a lightweight architectural safeguard that complementarily reduces the need for aggressive penalties and helps maintain a steady tug of war between the two players. In practice, you often see spectral normalization paired with robust training regimes to prevent sudden swings in outputs as you scale models or datasets. Gradient penalties offer another principled route to stability. The popular WGAN GP approach enforces a one Lipschitz constraint not just globally, but locally through a gradient penalty on interpolated real and fake samples. This tends to produce smoother, more consistent gradients and broader mode coverage compared with plain adversarial losses. The trade-off is computational overhead, but the payoff is often clearer convergence behavior and less sensitivity to hyperparameter blowups. Beyond penalties, the two timescale update rule, or TTUR, reminds us that the generator and discriminator do not need to learn at the same pace. Using different learning rates or different optimizers for G and D can dramatically improve balance, especially in large-scale or high-capacity settings. It's not unusual to see a faster discriminator early in training and a calibrated generator later, or vice versa, depending on the observed dynamics. Learning rate scheduling deserves a second look. Cyclic or one-cycle policies, warm restarts, and adaptive schedules can prevent late-stage stagnation or premature collapse. The guiding principle is to allow rapid early exploration and then gradual refinement as the model's distribution begins to resemble the target. In tandem with normalization techniques and penalties, scheduling helps the model settle rather than overreact. Initialization remains foundational. Xavier or he initialization continues to set a sane starting point for deep adversarial nets, reducing the likelihood of vanishing or exploding gradients and easing subsequent optimization. Evaluation is where the rubber meets the road. Fresheth inception distance (FID) is now a standard, measuring how close the generated and real distributions are in a learned feature space. Lower FID indicates more realistic and diverse samples, but interpret it carefully. FID depends on the feature, extractor, batch sizes, and dataset. Complement FID with perceptual metrics like LPIPS or precision recall analysis to capture both quality and diversity. When reporting, use consistent evaluation protocols and, where possible, held out test sets to avoid optimistic biases. Hybrid approaches also deserve attention. Combining GANs with VAEs or normalizing flows can blend the strengths of likelihood estimation with sharp realism. Perceptual losses and feature matching serve as stabilizing surrogates that guide the generator toward semantically faithful results. Before we turn the page, a quick map of what's coming. We'll connect how the generator learns to see and shape data from early edges and colors to fuller textures and believable details, while the discriminator keeps score and gates progress. You'll hear about how network depth and width influence what the model can represent, and why bigger isn't always better without regularization. We'll discuss practical limits, longer training, more compute, and the art of keeping learning stable. Then we'll introduce tools that help generalize dropout, batch normalization, and spectral normalization, and how they curb overfitting and reduce mode collapse. Finally, expect simple analogies like a choir learning in harmony or a bookshelf growing taller and wider to ground the ideas. Together, these parts steer GANs toward sharper textures, richer variety, and more reliable generation across tasks. Let me take us a bit deeper into how the generator learns and what modern practices do to raise both realism and diversity in generated images. Think of the learning process as a careful sculpting with digital clay. The generator starts with coarse forms and progressively refines them into convincing detail, while the discriminator acts as a disciplined coach guiding every pass. On feature learning, the generator builds hierarchical representations. Early layers still resemble simple detectors, edges, colors, basic textures. Mid-level layers begin to assemble these edges into coherent motifs, like parts of a face or a branch of a tree. Deeper layers stitch those motifs into full objects and scene structures. This hierarchy is not just about visual appeal. It underpins generalization. When the latent-to-image map respects a structured progression from simple to complex, the model can interpolate between modes and produce varied outputs that still align with real data statistics. But the learning signal has to be well-behaved to realize this potential. Modern stabilization techniques are essential. Spectral normalization constrains the discriminator's weight matrices, effectively controlling the Lipschitz constant. This leads to more stable gradients for the generator and prevents the kind of dramatic swings that can derail training. Gradient penalties, as in WGAN-GP, add a penalty on the gradient norm of the discriminator with respect to its inputs. The result is smoother, more informative feedback and a reduction in mode collapse. In practice, practitioners also employ a 2-time-scale update rule. The discriminator often gets a slightly higher learning rate or more updates per step than the generator, preserving a healthy competitive tension without overwhelming either side. The design of the discriminator itself matters. A thoughtful architecture with appropriate depth, residual connections, and sometimes self-attention for long-range dependencies helps the network detect textures, lighting consistency, and coherent structure. When combined with normalization and Lipschitz constraints, the discriminator becomes a sharper, more reliable critic, which in turn pushes the generator toward finer textures and more global realism. How do we know we are improving? Evaluation metrics are essential anchors. Fréchet inception distance FID has become a standard. It compares the statistics of real and generated samples in a pre-trained feature space, capturing both quality and diversity. Lower FID is better, and the metric rewards samples that occupy similar feature space distributions as real images. In parallel, researchers look at perceptual or feature mobility losses or use ancillary metrics like precision recall for distributions to ensure we're not just producing sharp images but also preserving mode coverage. Hybrid models illustrate the payoff of combining strengths. VAE GAN hybrids blend likelihood-based objectives with adversarial training to balance fidelity and sample sharpness. Perceptual losses matching high-level features from a pre-trained network guide the generator toward images that not only look real but align with human judgments of realism. Together with stabilization techniques, these approaches push GANs toward reliable, diverse, and high-quality generation suitable for research, industry, and education. Now let's drill into how depth and width shape modern GANs in practice, beyond the intuition of stacking layers or widening nets. In contemporary setups, deeper networks help the model organize information into higher-level abstractions. They enable the generator to map simple latent codes into progressively richer manifolds, and the discriminator to detect subtler inconsistencies. But depth also tightens the training regime. Vanishing or exploding gradients can destabilize learning, and deeper models can overfit if regularization is weak or data is limited. To harness depth effectively, we rely on architectural and regularization tricks that maintain stable optimization. Two key stability levers stand out here. First, spectral normalization constrains the spectral norm of each layer in the discriminator, effectively bounding the Lipschitz constant and stabilizing gradients during adversarial updates. Second, gradient penalties such as those used in Wasserstein GAN with gradient penalty explicitly encourage smoothness in the discriminator's decision boundary. Together, they allow deeper discriminators and generators to learn more expressive mappings without sacrificing convergence. Residual connections and skip paths also help preserve gradient flow, enabling deeper generators to learn hierarchical features without implausible optimization paths. Turning to width, broader networks expand representational capacity to capture diverse ideas and modes in the data. Width is particularly impactful when you need to model multimodal distributions or fine-grained variations. However, excessive width without careful regularization or architectural discipline can destabilize training and inflate compute. A practical approach is to couple wider generators with multi-scale or hierarchical discriminators so the model evaluates realism at multiple resolutions. Regularization, batch normalization variants, and judicious use of normalization layers become crucial as width grows. Training time and resources inevitably rise with both depth and width. This is where design strategies matter. Progressive growing, as in early GAN variants, or style-based architectures like style GAN introduce controlled capacity growth and efficient training dynamics. Hybrid models such as VAE GAN hybrids or score-based divided by energy-based hybrids offer pathways to leverage the strengths of different paradigms while containing training cost and improving sample quality. Evaluation matters here too. Beyond qualitative inspection, use metrics like Fréchet inception distance and kernel inception distance key to quantify how closely generated samples match real data in feature space, along with precision divided by recall trade-offs for mode coverage. LPAPS can gauge perceptual similarity and regular diagnostic plots, latent interpolations, traversal, and loss curves help diagnose overfitting or instability. Bottom line, depth adds hierarchical understanding, width broadens expressive capacity, but both come with stability and compute trade-offs. The goal is to tune depth and width to the task, leveraging normalization, penalties, multi-scale evaluations, and, when helpful, hybrid approaches to achieve accurate, stable, and generalizable generative models. Building on those regularization ideas, we can push GAN training stability and generator quality further by embracing two complementary strands: Lipschitz constrained objectives, including spectral normalization and gradient penalties, and principled evaluation, plus hybrid architectures that blend modeling paradigms. First, on Lipschitz control and gradients. Spectral normalization regularizes each layer by constraining its spectral norm, which dampens extreme amplification of signals and helps prevent sudden explosions in the discriminator's gradients. Gradient penalties take a related route by directly shaping the loss landscape. For example, the gradient penalty used in WGAN GP enforces that the discriminator's gradient with respect to its inputs has unique norm along interpolated samples. This creates a smooth, stable objective and reduces the risk of mode collapse caused by highly uneven gradients. In practice, you'll balance the penalty weight lambda to avoid over-constraining the network. The goal is steady, informative feedback rather than perfectly flat landscapes. When you combine spectral normalization with gradient penalties, you often gain robustness across architectures and datasets, since each method targets different aspects of the Lipschitz property. Second, evaluation metrics and diagnostics. The Fréchet inception distance, or FID, has become a standard for quantifying how close the generated distribution is to the real distribution in a perceptual feature space. It captures both quality and diversity, but it's not a perfect oracle. It can be sensitive to the feature space and data domain. Use FID in conjunction with other measures such as inception score for coarse diversity, MSSS sim for perceptual similarity, or precision recall metrics that separate quality, precision from coverage recall of the data manifold. Regular monitoring of these metrics during experiments helps detect mode-seeking behavior or sample diversity loss early, guiding adjustments to penalties, capacity, or data augmentation. Third, hybrid and auxiliary architectures. Hybrid models such as VAE GANs, which couple an encoder with adversarial training to map data to latent space, offer stable representations and improved sample diversity. BGAN-type energy-based formulations can balance reconstruction-like losses with adversarial objectives. More recently, GANs are integrated with diffusion principles or normalizing flows to combine sample quality with tractable likelihoods. When designing hybrids, align regularization and Lipschitz constraints with the auxiliary objectives A, G, encoder consistency, latent space smoothness to avoid conflicting signals during training. Practically, you tune these tools to achieve a balance. Enough constraint to stabilize gradients and prevent mode collapse, but enough flexibility to preserve diversity and high-fidelity details. If penalties or normalization overly dampen learning, or if FID deteriorates, adjust weights, re-examine architecture capacity, or introduce mild curriculum or warm-up for penalties. With the right mix, GANs can deliver both stable training dynamics and richly varied, realistic outputs across challenging datasets. Next, we'll explore how GANs can be steered with conditioning. By feeding labels or attributes into both the generator and the discriminator, you gain control over what the model creates and keep results diverse yet relevant. We'll examine the practical tweaks that make this possible, adding condition vectors, using embedding to compress labels, and wiring attributes into inputs and normalization so the network respects your chosen styles. Then, we turn to progressive growing and dynamic adaptation, starting with simple shapes, gradually adding detail, and even letting parts of the network expand during training to prevent sudden jumps and reduce artifacts. Finally, we'll cover attention and recurrence, which help the model pick out important features and maintain coherence across time or frames. Expect an outlook on applications from targeted image synthesis to smoother video, consistent audio, and reliable long sequence generation. These ideas form a toolkit for more intentional, high-quality generation. Conditional GANs allow us to steer generation by supplying labels or attributes, but to move from idea to robust practice, we need to look under the hood and address stabilization, conditioning mechanisms, and evaluation. In this session, I will focus on advanced aspects that researchers typically optimize beyond the basic conditioning loop. First, conditioning should influence both generator and discriminator in a mutually informative way. Beyond simply concatenating a condition vector with the latent input, modern architectures inject conditioning at multiple depths. Conditional normalization layers, such as conditional batch normalization or adaptive instance normalization, modulate feature maps with parameters derived from the condition. A particularly flexible approach is FILM, which applies feature-wise affine transformations, gamma and beta, computed from the conditioning signal to guide the generator's activations. This lets the network learn where and how strongly a given attribute should affect representation as data flows through the network. On the discrimination side, the conditioning signal can be incorporated with a projection discriminator, where the condition vector is projected onto the discriminator's final feature space and interacts with the learned features. This creates a direct, data-efficient way for the discriminator to enforce consistency between the generated content and the conditioning clues. An alternative is to use an auxiliary classifier head AC GAN that predicts the conditioning label, providing an additional gradient signal that encourages attribute-faithful outputs. Stabilizing training under conditioning is crucial. Spectral normalization constrains the Lipschitz constant of the discriminator, improving stability when learning from conditioned signals. Gradient penalties, such as the WGAN-GP approach, help maintain balanced gradients and prevent collapse or mode dropping, especially when conditioning introduces sharp attribute boundaries. When conditioning on multiple attributes or continuous controls, you can regularize with auxiliary penalties that penalize inconsistent attribute relationships. Evaluation of conditional generation benefits from targeted metrics. In addition to the unconditional Frechet inception distance, FID, researchers report conditional FID or attribute-wise accuracy, measuring how often the generated samples satisfy the specified attributes. Perceptual similarity metrics, LPIPS, and diversity measures, MSSSEM, should be tracked across attribute-specified subsets. A practical check is to train a separate high-capacity attribute classifier on generated images and report its accuracy on the conditioning labels, which reveals how faithfully the model encodes the cues. Hybrid models combining probabilistic encoders with adversarial decoders or integrating diffusion priors offer routes to better disentanglement and fidelity while keeping conditioning explicit. In practice, you might start with conditional BN or FILM, test projection-based discriminators, and monitor both realism and fidelity to attributes, classifier-based accuracy. The payoff is controllable, diverse, and credible outputs that align with the specified cues across domains from fashion to medical imaging and beyond. Building on the ideas you already seen, this slide invites us to examine how progressive growing and network adaptation interact with stabilization techniques that researchers now rely on for high-fidelity generation. The goal remains better pictures, but with more predictable training dynamics and efficient use of compute across scales. First, recall the core mechanism. We start at a coarse, low-resolution representation and gradually increase complexity by adding layers while softly blending in new capacity. This fade-in helps both generator and discriminator adjust without abrupt shifts that could derail learning. As the resolution increases, the model learns coarse geometry first and then refines details, texture, and structure in a controlled curriculum. In practice, this is complemented by dynamic adaptation. The network grows its capacity during training, either by adding layers, depth, or widening layers width as the task demands more representational power. The result is a learning trajectory that tracks the increasing complexity of scenes from broad shapes to fine-grained texture with fewer discontinuities and fewer glaring artifacts. To keep this growth stable, modern practitioners deploy stabilization techniques at the same time. Spectral normalization constrains the spectral norm of each layer in the discriminator, helping to bound its Lipschitz constant as new blocks are introduced. Gradient penalties, as in WGAN-GP, provide an explicit regularization signal that enforces smoothness in the discriminator's decision boundary, which is particularly valuable when the model's capacity is expanding. When you couple progressive growth with these penalties, you gain more consistent gradients across scales and a smoother transition as new resolution blocks come online. Evaluation matters, too. As you progressively generate higher resolution images, use metrics that capture both fidelity and diversity. FID, Frechet inception distance, remains a standard oracle for comparing distributions of real and generated images, especially when you track it across scales. Complement FID with KID, kernel inception distance, to mitigate bias in finite samples, and consider perceptual metrics like LPAPS to assess perceptual similarity to real textures. When reporting, also note stability indicators, artifact rates at boundaries between resolutions, and the smoothness of the learned texture maps. Hybrid approaches are increasingly common. One can marry progressive GANs with diffusion refinements or employ multi-scale discriminators that operate at different resolutions to enforce consistency across scales. Perceptual losses or feature modality terms can be added to guide high-frequency texture synthesis without sacrificing global coherence. Today, I want to take the discussion a step further and connect attention and recurrence to practical, state-of-the-art improvements in GANs. We know attention helps the network allocate capacity where it matters, and recurrence preserves context across time. The combination, especially in vision, video, and audio tasks, yields outputs that are not only sharper but more coherent across long sequences. A key advance in stabilizing attention-rich GANs is to enforce robust, well-behaved mappings through regularization and normalization. Spectral normalization can be applied to the projection and query divided by key divided by value computations inside self-attention blocks, ensuring the attention operator itself remains one Lipschitz-like. This reduces dramatic swings in the discriminator's feedback when attention focuses on highly informative regions, which in turn stabilizes generator updates. Complementarily, gradient penalties, such as the WGAN-GP style term, or more task-aligned penalties on the discriminator around attention-rich regions, help curb high-variance gradients that can arise when attention emphasizes fine textures or long-range dependencies. In practice, one tunes these penalties with care to avoid over-smoothing or under-regularizing the model's capacity to attend to critical details. Evaluation has evolved beyond traditional loss curves. In addition to Frechet inception distance, FID, for distributional similarity, we rely on Frechet video distance, FED, for video and LPIPS-based perceptual metrics to gauge fine-grained realism. Kernel inception distance, KD, can complement FID, and precision recall analysis illuminate whether attention-driven models preserve diverse modes without collapsing to a few salient patterns. When temporal components are central, temporal consistency metrics and ablations E, G, removing the attention module or recurrent path, clarify how much each component contributes to coherence over frames or syllables. Hybrid architectures exemplify the trend. Self-attention GANs, SEGAN, and non-local blocks bring powerful long-range coupling to generators and discriminators. Vision transformers and transformer-inspired backbones are increasingly integrated with GAN frameworks. For sequential data, spatiotemporal attention, often with lightweight recurrence, yields stable long horizon generation. We can also envision hybrids with diffusion or VAE elements to improve latent modeling while preserving the sharpness induced by adversarial training. In practice, these designs demand careful data handling, balanced optimization between generator and discriminator, and thoughtful visualization of attention maps to diagnose failure modes. The overarching message remains, by teaching the model where to look and what to remember, we achieve more realistic, context-aware outputs across long videos, speeches, and sequential textures. Now picture a writer who reads a story and then draws scenes. Welcome to the section on balancing the generator and discriminator. In the next parts, we'll unpack why training can stumble, mode collapse where the generator keeps spitting out a narrow set of outputs, and oscillation where updates chase contradictory goals. We'll show how the balance between the two networks matters. When one side runs away, learning stalls or outputs become dull. Then we outline practical remedies, tune learning rates and apply gradient penalties to keep steps smooth, adjust architecture to give both sides enough capacity, use batch normalization to stabilize signals, and monitor not just final accuracy but loss curves to catch instability early. We'll also discuss scaling concerns. Larger networks demand computation, so we explore model compression, pruning, quantization, and knowledge distillation, plus when and how to apply them. Finally, real-world examples illustrate how these ideas play out in media apps and services. Beyond stating that mode collapse and oscillation are problems, this part is about how to diagnose and tame them with deeper, implementable strategies. In practice, instability often stems from a mismatch in how the generator and discriminator learn, not from some abstract imbalance. When the discriminator becomes too powerful, the generator learns to produce a narrow set of patterns that just fool a tough critic, collapsing the diversity of the data distribution. Conversely, if updates chase each other too aggressively, training can bounce around without settling oscillations that prevent convergence. A modern stabilizing toolkit starts with constraining the discriminator's capacity and shaping the loss landscape. Spectral normalization is a practical first step. By regulating the spectral norm of each layer's weight, you enforce a Lipschitz constraint that makes the discriminator's decision boundary smoother and less sensitive to small input perturbations. This often reduces training jerkiness and makes the generator's gradient signals more meaningful. Gradient penalties, as used in WGA-NGP, are another principal fix. Penalizing deviations of the gradient from unit norm on interpolations between real and fake samples nudges the model towards smoother, more stable updates. Related penalties like R1 divided by R2 finite difference norms on real or fake data can also help when you observe real data gradients driving instability. Beyond penalties, consider the update dynamics themselves. The two timescale update rule suggests using different learning rates for the generator and discriminator and updating them at a controlled cadence. This can prevent the two networks from perpetually chasing one another. For even more foresight, unrolled GANs simulate several steps of discriminator optimization within each generator update, giving the generator a more stable or forward-looking view of how the discriminator will react. Architectural and normalization choices matter too. When using spectral normalization, batch normalization can become unnecessary or even harmful. Choose layers and normalization schemes that promote smooth learning. You can experiment with narrower or wider architectures and incorporate skip connections or conditioning to improve cooperation between the two players. Evaluation matters as well. Use FID and kernel inception distance key to quantify realism and diversity, but also track precision recall for generative models, and MS SSIM to gauge diversity across samples. Relying on a single metric can mask either quality loss or mode coverage gaps. Hybrid approaches are increasingly effective. Combining GAN objectives with reconstruction or contrastive losses, as in VAE GAN or certain diffusion GAN hybrids, can stabilize training and broaden mode coverage. Quietly effective tweaks include label smoothing, modest noise injections, and carefully staged data augmentation to encourage broader responses from the generator. In short, stabilize with Lipschitz control and penalties, balance updates with TTUR divided by unrolled perspectives, verify with robust metrics, and consider hybrid objectives when pure adversarial training still stalls. With disciplined tuning and monitoring, you push GANs toward reliable, richly varied outputs. Balancing the generator and discriminator is not a fixed setting. It's a dynamic, ongoing adjustment as training unfolds. Beyond the intuition you already heard, there are concrete, advanced levers researchers use to keep G and D in productive tension and to avoid stagnation or collapse. First, consider two-time scale training. The idea is to treat the generator and discriminator as two learners with different update rates. Rather than giving them the same learning rate and update frequency, you tune them so that the discriminator does not outrun the generator too aggressively or vice versa. In practice, that often means a smaller learning rate for the discriminator or more frequent generator updates, or both. The goal is a stable Nash-like dynamic where each side continually adapts to the other's current strategy rather than chasing a moving target with a stale gradient. Second, regularize the discriminator with spectral normalization. By constraining the Lipschitz constant of D through spectral norms, we reduce extreme sensitivity to input changes and prevent sharp, unstable shifts in D's decision boundary. This makes the gradient landscape smoother for the generator to navigate. Often, researchers apply spectral normalization to D and sometimes to G in tandem with gradient penalties to reinforce stability. Third, gradient penalties and related regularizers. The gradient penalty from WGAN-GP enforces a soft one Lipschitz constraint by penalizing deviations of the gradient norm from 1. This helps prevent explosive gradients and encourages smoother updates. Path length regularization, popular in some GAN families, encourages the generator to map latent space changes to proportional, smooth changes in output, supporting diversity without destabilizing training. Fourth, architectural and objective enhancements to aid balance. Using multi-scale discriminators allows the model to critique both global structure and fine details, keeping the generator honest across resolutions. Feature matching or mini-batch discrimination can encourage the generator to cover more modes rather than producing a few shortcuts. Regularization and careful capacity planning, boosting the weaker network modestly, adding skip connections, or employing attention mechanisms can maintain productive competition without overfitting either side. Fifth, hybrid modeling and richer objectives. VAE GAN hybrids, such as architectures that couple a reconstruction objective with adversarial guidance, can stabilize training and improve encoder latent representations, helping the generator explore diverse, meaningful modes. More recently, incorporating density estimation or flow-based components can complement adversarial loss and provide additional guidance to the learning dynamics. Sixth, evaluation and monitoring. Use FID as a primary real data-driven signal of both quality and diversity, but augment with KID, an unbiased alternative, and precision recall analysis to quantify mode coverage. Track gradient norms, loss curves, and per layer activity to detect when one side is dominating. Trigger adjustments, tuning learning rates, applying a gradient penalty, or reconfiguring the discriminator's capacity based on these signals. In short, stable GAN training emerges from a toolbox. TTUR-inspired learning rate planning, Lipschitz regularization, spectral normalization, and gradient penalties, multi-scale and regularized architectures, thoughtful hybrid objectives, and vigilant performance monitoring with robust metrics. Use them in concert to keep generator and discriminator learning together, and the results will be richer and more reliable. As we push toward practical deployment, the reality is that large GANs demand substantial compute power and memory. That pressure shows up not only in hardware costs, but in energy use, cooling needs, and the time required to reach useful performance. The goal, therefore, is not just bigger models, but smarter ones, architectures and training procedures that deliver high-quality generative performance with tractable compute. Starting with training stability and efficiency, we can lean on advances that allow us to use powerful models without paying a prohibitive time penalty. Spectral normalization, for example, constrains the discriminator's Lipschitz constant, aiding stable learning and often permitting more aggressive scaling without destabilizing gradients. This can reduce the number of training epochs needed to reach a given quality. Relatedly, gradient penalties such as the WGAN GP approach impose a regularization term on the gradient with respect to inputs, smoothing training dynamics, and mitigating mode collapse. These techniques can produce reliable convergence even when we push toward larger capacity or more complex architectures, effectively cutting wasted compute. Beyond stability, there are concrete compression and efficiency methods. Pruning removes weak connections to create sparse networks, ideally after a period of dense training, followed by fine-tuning. Quantization reduces memory bandwidth by using lower precision representations. Quantization-aware training helps preserve accuracy, is less than #0. 5 is greater than weight sharing, low-rank factorization, and structured pruning can yield substantial speedups on real hardware. In practice, you can combine these with careful retraining to preserve fidelity, and you can measure gains not just in flops, but in actual wall clock time and energy per inference. Distillation remains a powerful ally for efficiency. A high-quality teacher model can guide a compact student through soft targets and learned representations, often with temperature scaling to emphasize interclass similarities. This is especially valuable when latency is critical, such as real-time rendering or edge devices. When deploying, you can also explore hybrid strategies, tiny discriminators paired with training time augmentations, or combining GANs with elements from VAEs or normalizing flow components to capture diverse modes with fewer parameters. Evaluation matters too. While FID provides a useful signal, pair it with KID, LPIPS, and precision recall analysis to avoid overfitting to a single metric. Conduct ablations and standardize benchmarks to quantify speedups, memory reductions, and energy savings, ensuring that compression does not erode the very qualities you aim to preserve. In short, efficient scaling is about intentional design choices, stability-enhancing regularizations, smarter compression, thoughtful distillation, and robust evaluation. When balanced well, we achieve practical, fast, and reliable GANs that remain scientifically rigorous and deployment-ready. From the big picture concepts, we now zoom in on 3 concrete approaches that illustrate the spectrum of modern generative models. Style GAN introduces a progressive generator and a mapping network that separates latent factors from features, giving designers precise control over style at different levels. You'll see how adaptive normalization and style mixing let one base image yield many looks with fewer artifacts thanks to layer-wise control. Next, CycleGAN shows how you can translate between domains without paired data using cycle consistency and a compact 2 discriminator setup to preserve content while changing appearance. Finally, BigGAN pushes scale using large architectures to capture complex, realistic patterns, and it comes with trade-offs in training time, data needs, and hardware. Taken together, these slides reveal how space, style, and capacity shape what we can generate and how we apply it. StyleGAN remains a focal point not just for what it generates, but for how researchers extend and stabilize the generation process. Building on the ideas in the slide, several advanced threads have become standard tools in our toolbox. First, stabilization techniques from the broader GAN literature have been integrated with style-based generators. Spectral normalization is commonly applied to discriminators to bound the Lipschitz constant, which helps prevent explosive updates without unduly constraining capacity. Gradient penalties, such as R1 on real data or penalties framed in a WGAN GP style, encourage smoother gradients and more stable convergence. In StyleGAN families, these ideas are paired with architectural refinements, most notably weight demodulation in StyleGAN 2 to reduce artifacts that can arise when per-layer styles interact with convolutions. Second, we have richer ways to quantify and diagnose quality. While freshet inception distance remains the workhorse metric for comparing distributions of real and generated images, it is supplemented by perceptual measures such as LPIPS to capture human perceived differences between samples. Researchers also employ path length regularization to encourage smooth, linear changes in image appearance as the latent code is varied, an important property for reliable editing. Precision divided by recall metrics for generative models give a sense of how well the model covers the data distribution while avoiding spurious samples. In practice, these metrics guide not just evaluation but hyperparameter tuning during training, helping to balance fidelity, diversity, and editability. Third, we see productive hybrid approaches and editing workflows. Hybrid models combine the strengths of GANs with other paradigms, VAEs for compact latent representations, or diffusion-like steps for stochastic refinement, yielding more controllable and robust workflows. Inversion pipelines pair an encoder with StyleGAN to map real images into the latent space, enabling precise edits and semantically meaningful manipulations. Text or clip-guided editing shows how high-level concepts can steer style space directions, enabling targeted changes without retraining. There is also growing work on 3D-aware or multi-view extensions that leverage the same style disentangling principles to produce coherent appearances across viewpoints. Finally, with power comes responsibility. The practical gains depend on data quality, computational resources, and careful evaluation. Researchers stress reproducibility, transparent reporting of metrics, and thoughtful framing of ethical considerations, bias, misuse, and licensing as integral to advancing StyleGAN-based methods responsibly. In short, StyleGAN remains a flexible platform. Advanced regularization, rigorous evaluation, and hybrid editing strategies push the boundaries of controllable, high-fidelity image synthesis. CycleGAN takes us beyond paired data by learning bidirectional mappings with cycle consistency, but the real power shows up when we push it with stabilization, evaluation, and architectural refinements. Let me walk you through some of these advanced aspects that researchers routinely incorporate to get reliable, publishable results. First, on stability and regularization. In practice, discriminators can become the main source of instability if their gradients fluctuate wildly. Two effective tools are spectral normalization and gradient penalties. Spectral normalization constrains the spectral norm of each layer's weight matrix, which keeps the discriminator's Lipschitz constant in check and smooths gradient flow to the generators. Gradient penalties, as in WGAN GP, impose an explicit penalty on deviations from unit gradient norm for interpolations between real and fake samples. Together, they reduce mode hopping and oscillations, making training more predictable without sacrificing sharpness in the generated images. Second, evaluation and diagnostics. We often rely on quantitative metrics to compare models and track progress. The Frechet inception distance is a standard for measuring how close the distribution of generated images is to real images in the target domain. Lower is better. When using unpaired data, you compute FID between the generated samples in one domain and real samples from that same domain, while carefully sampling to avoid leakage. Other useful metrics include the sliced Wasserstein distance for texture level alignment and LPIPS for perceptual similarity that aligns better with human judgment. Remember that no single metric tells the whole story. Complement FID with perceptual and task relevant evaluations and, when possible, human studies. Third, architectural enhancements and hybrids. Besides the classic two generators and two discriminators, researchers explore variants like patch GAN discriminators to capture fine-grained texture and attention mechanisms to focus translation on semantically important regions. Hybrid approaches bring in auxiliary losses, identity losses to preserve color when domain A maps to B with similar content, and semantic or perceptual losses using pre-trained networks to enforce higher-level consistency. Spatial transformers or alignment modules can be integrated to handle geometric differences between domains, reducing the burden on the generators to hallucinate structure. Finally, practical takeaways. Balance the adversarial loss, cycle consistency, and any auxiliary losses with thoughtful weighting. Use stabilization techniques like spectral normalization or gradient penalties, and adopt robust evaluation protocols with multiple metrics. When done well, cycle GAN variants with these enhancements deliver convincing, content-faithful translations, even in challenging cross-domain tasks such as day to night, season changes, or artistic style transfers. Pushing to big GAN scale and beyond means embracing very large networks that generate images with unprecedented fidelity and variety. But as we scale up, the story moves from more parameters equals better results to a careful blend of capacity, regularization, and robust evaluation. In practice, the gains from high-capacity generators and discriminators come with stability challenges, and the design choices we make around regularization and evaluation become decisive. First, on stabilization and capacity. As networks grow in width and depth, the Lipschitz properties of the critic become critical for reliable training. Spectral normalization is a widely adopted tool here. By constraining the spectral norm of 8 matrices in the discriminator, we keep the critic's gradients well behaved, which helps the generator learn meaningful gradients even when the model is very large. Complementary to that, gradient penalties, such as those used in WGN GP, enforce soft constraints on the gradient norm of the critic with respect to its inputs. These penalties help prevent pathological behaviors like rapid, unstable oscillations or collapse to a small subset of modes when the generator capacity is high and the data distribution is complex. Together, they enable training with larger models and diverse data without sacrificing convergence. Second, training at scale requires attention to infrastructure and optimization. Large models demand substantial data pipelines, distributed and mixed precision training, and memory-efficient architectures. Synchronized normalization schemes, careful gradient accumulation, and selective use of attention mechanisms to capture long-range dependencies become practical levers to extract richer structure without an exponential rise in compute. The result can be crisper textures, more accurate color renditions, and better global coherence in scenes that contain fine-grained detail. Third, evaluation becomes more nuanced with high-capacity models. Beyond traditional metrics like FID, practitioners increasingly rely on a battery of measures. Freshet inception distance tracks distributional similarity between real and generated images, while precision recall analyzes gauge fidelity versus coverage of the learned distribution. Perceptual metrics such as LPIPS provide insight into perceptual differences, and newer recall-based metrics assess how well the model captures the diversity of real data. It's important to interpret these metrics collectively and, where possible, complement them with human judgments for tasks with strong perceptual requirements. Fourth, design strategies and hybrids. Large-scale generators often benefit from conditioning and architectural enhancements, such as class conditioning with normalization tailored to each class, self-attention to model dependencies across the image, and multi-stage or hierarchical generation to separate coarse layout from fine texture. Hybrid approaches combining GANs with diffusion refinements or integrating variational or energy-based components as priors can offer improved stability or sample quality at scale. Finally, real-world implications. High-capacity networks enable more faithful art and design tools, richer data augmentation for downstream models, and advanced synthetic imaging across domains like medicine and remote sensing. But they demand disciplined trade-offs among accuracy, resources, and evaluation rigor. By balancing regularization, scalable optimization, and robust metrics, researchers can harness the power of large models while maintaining principled control over quality and diversity. Taken together, the directions outlined for GANs point to a future where science and art advance in tandem. More stable, data-efficient training will make learning robust even with limited data. Diffusion-augmented frameworks will deliver richer detail. Multimodal and conditional generation will translate ideas into images, video, and sound more smoothly. On-device generation and privacy-preserving training will broaden access while reducing risk. Evaluation, safety, and transparency via better metrics, watermarks, and controllable features will support trust. Architectural progress with transformers and attention will sharpen focus on complex scenes, while interpretability and user-driven control empower creators. Crucially, collaborative ecosystems, mentors, universities, startups, students, and designers will accelerate iteration and responsible deployment. These directions will make GANs more useful and responsible, balancing creativity with accountability as the field moves forward. Transformers have sharpened our ability to capture long-range structure, and when we combine them with GANs, we unlock memory across the entire scene. In practice, the generator can maintain consistency from a distant building to a foreground texture, reducing mismatches and blurry borders. Beyond images, this capacity matters for multimodal generation and structured data such as city maps or narrative arcs, where maintaining global coherence is as important as local detail. To push stability and quality further, two kinds of training time controls are indispensable. Spectral normalization constrains the Lipschitz constant of the discriminator by normalizing weight matrices by their spectral norm. This simple constraint tends to stabilize GAN optimization, making the generator updates more reliable and the learning signal more informative. Complementarily, gradient penalties, think WGAN, GP, or R1 divided by R2 penalties, explicitly encourage smoothness of the discriminator's output with respect to the data. Together, they reduce mode, collapse, and yield sharper, more faithful samples without resorting to brittle hyperparameter tuning. Evaluation also needs to keep pace with these advances. The Freshet Inception Distance (FID) remains a central benchmark. It compares the statistics of real versus generated features, giving a sense of both realism and diversity. It's often complemented by LP-IPS for perceptual similarity, and sometimes KID or IS for cross-validation across datasets. Beyond single number scores, a thorough evaluation probes generalization across resolutions, scenes, and modalities, and includes human studies when feasibility allows. Efficient, reliable evaluation is crucial as models scale. Neural architecture search, or NAS, has emerged as a powerful ally. By exploring search spaces that include transformer blocks, attention patterns, and hybrid connections, NAS discovers task-tuned architectures that balance capacity and efficiency. The result is architectures tailored to the task, not just presets, with fewer wasted training runs. NAS also supports practical constraints, smaller memory footprints, faster inference, or energy-aware training by guiding the mixture of layers, attention heads, and skip connections. Self-supervised learning compounds these gains. Pretext tasks predicting missing patches, solving rotated image orientations, or contrastive objectives produce robust representations without labeled data. These representations transfer to generation tasks, improving disentanglement, coverage, and robustness across data types. When combined with GANs, they can stabilize training and enable high-quality outputs even when labeled data are scarce. Finally, hybrid models GANs that integrate diffusion components, VAEs, or transformer-based priors can blend the strengths of each paradigm. Such hybrids, especially when guided by spectral normalization, gradient penalties, and NAS-optimized backbones, offer scalable paths to richer, more controllable generations while keeping an eye on cost and energy. In sum, these advances chart a path toward generative systems that are coherent, reliable, and broadly useful in the real world. Good training stability often comes from smarter network design that goes beyond the basics. Today, I'll expand on how advanced choices in normalization, activation, and training dynamics help GANs learn reliably even on real-world noisy data. Building on Aidin and Swish, we can integrate complementary techniques that address the core instability, uncontrolled discriminator, power, brittle gradient flow, and mode collapse. First, consider spectral normalization. By constraining the spectral norm of each weight matrix in the discriminator, we cap the Lipschitz constant of the network. This keeps discriminator gradients well behaved and prevents overly sharp updates that destabilize the generator. It's a lightweight, principled guardrail that often yields steadier convergence across datasets. Along similar lines, gradient penalties, most famously the WGAN GP penalty, enforce smooth changes in the discriminator output with respect to its input. This encourages a more stable gradient signal to the generator and reduces oscillations during training. Another pragmatic lever is two timescale update rules and adaptive balancing. TTUR assigns slightly different learning rates to the generator and the discriminator to reflect their non-identical optimization dynamics, while adaptive loss weighting modulates the emphasis on realism versus fidelity as training progresses. These mechanisms act like cruise control. The model self-tunes the push-pull dynamics so neither side overwhelms the other for long. In practice, such autonomous balancing accelerates convergence and lowers the risk of persistent mode collapse. Beyond normalization and penalties, evaluation and robustness fundamentals guide design choices. Metrics such as Frechet inception distance, FID, and when appropriate, the kernel inception distance provide a quantitative read on both quality and diversity. Monitoring precision and recall of generated samples helps diagnose mode coverage versus artifact generation. When researchers couple these metrics with ablation studies, they can isolate the impact of each architectural or training change, ensuring improvements are robust rather than brittle. Hybrid architectures also offer stability advantages. Hybrid GAN VAE models combine perceptual coherence from reconstruction losses with adversarial realism, often yielding smoother latent traversals and better coverage of modes. Diffusion-inspired or multi-stage generation strategies can further stabilize learning by decoupling core structure from fine details. In practice, conditioning signals, class labels, style codes, or domain constraints paired with robust regularization tend to stabilize training and improve utility in science and medicine. Think of GANs not just as a playful back and forth between two players, but as a carefully engineered system where stability, realism, and relevance are engineered into the training loop. Beyond the basic push-pull intuition, two families of techniques have become essential for serious research work. First, consider training stability and realism. Spectral normalization constrains the discriminator's weights, helping prevent runaway gradients and making training more predictable across architectures. Gradient penalties, especially the WGAN GP approach, enforce a Lipschitz constraint that stabilizes the critics' updates and reduces mode collapse. When you combine these with architectural tricks such as residual paths, skip connections, or style-based generators, you gain finer control over the generated features at multiple scales. In practice, this matters a lot for medical images, where subtle texture and boundary details can influence diagnosis. Second, moving beyond vanilla GANs, researchers increasingly blend ideas from related generative paradigms. Hybrid models that pair GAN components with VAEs or diffusion-based priors can harness the strengths of each, the crisp, high-frequency detail from adversarial training and the explicit latent structure from variational or diffusion frameworks. Diffusion priors, in particular, have pushed fidelity to new heights and are inspiring hybrid training schemes where a GAN guides or refines diffusion sampling or where a VAE provides a compact latent scaffold for conditional generation. Evaluation is another critical area. Traditional metrics like FID and inception score offer distributional views of realism, but they are imperfect proxies for clinical usefulness. In medical imaging, practitioners emphasize task-based metrics, structural similarity, peak signal to noise ratio, PSNR, and region-wide measures alongside radiologist-driven assessments of diagnostic utility. When a GAN is used for reconstruction, segmentation, or anomaly detection, you should pair perceptual metrics with downstream task performance e.g. how much segmentation accuracy improves or how anomaly scores correlate with pathology. Cross-modal and multimodal extensions enrich the toolkit. Text-to-image, image-to-text, and cross-modal retrieval use alignment losses, and contrastive learning, think clip-style objectives, to fuse visual, textual, and even audio representations. Such designs enable models that can describe a scan, generate a caption for a medical image, or synthesize a supporting narrative alongside visuals, enhancing review workflows and educational tools. Finally, ethics and safety matter. Privacy-preserving strategies like differential privacy and federated training help protect patient data, while robust evaluation and transparency guard against over-reliance on synthetic data or over-interpretation of results. If you're translating this into school projects, you could start with a conditional GAN with spectral normalization, evaluate with SSIM and a simple FID, and then experiment with a small cross-modal extension or a lightweight hybrid with a diffusion prior. Advances in neural networks are pushing deepfakes toward near indistinguishability. That rising realism brings important ethical questions into our daily work and civic life. Misinformation can spread rapidly when images or voices appear authentic, and privacy breaches become feasible when faces are used without consent. In online spaces, questions of consent, who may use a likeness, for what purpose, and under what conditions are not always clear. To address these challenges, researchers and policymakers are calling for tighter governance and more capable detection tools. Effective detectors help us separate real from fake outputs quickly and with higher confidence, which is essential in fast-moving information environments. The slide also examines how neural networks shape the creation of deepfakes and what that implies for design and governance. Ethical safeguards embedded within systems can curb misuse by builders. One actionable idea is to integrate detection mechanisms directly into generation pipelines or playback software, so suspicious outputs can be flagged before they spread widely. Such tools can reveal when a video has been altered or synthesized, and they reduce the risk of uncritical acceptance. Transparency about usage is another pillar. Creators should disclose when content is synthetic or edited, enabling audiences to assess credibility. Promoting responsible AI development practices means recognizing that mitigating misuse through design requires more than a single fix, is less than #0. 5# is greater than. Accountability must be baked into projects from inception. Transparency involves showing what data were used to train the model, as well as the model's stated limits and capabilities. Proactive bias mitigation helps prevent harmful stereotypes and unfair outcomes, and developers carry a responsibility to prevent misuse while advancing fairness. This is especially important when people rely on AI for news, art, or education. Safety and trust depend on it. Therefore, responsibility in AI development is not optional, it is a core professional obligation for many designers. Students will create and use increasingly powerful tools in the future, and they should do so with respect for rights, privacy, and the law. Clear guidelines help everyone stay safer online and offline. As technology grows, so too must ethical awareness. By designing with care, we can harness the benefits of these tools while reducing potential harms. Responsibility in AI development should guide every choice we make. This ongoing collaboration between researchers, policy experts, and communities will shape not only the technology, but our norms for trust. As we bring this session to a close, I'd like to extend a few forward-looking reflections that practical lens through which we evaluate GANs in research and application. Considerably. Spectral normalization remains a simple yet effective, improving gradient behavior and often enabling more reliable convergence in gradient penalties such as the WGAN GP formulation or R1 divided by R2 regularization. We reduced mode collapse and clearer progress signals during optimization. These techniques don't just fix GANs, they reshape the learning landscape, making it easier to diagnose issues and compare architectures in a principled way. On evaluation, the community has coalesced around metrics that quantify both fidelity and diversity. Fresheth inception distance remains a go-to, linking generated and real distributions via a learned feature space, while the kernel inception distance keyed offers a bias-free alternative for smaller samples. Precision recall variants for generative models help disentangle quality from coverage, though they are not a panacea. All metrics abstract away perceptual nuance and domain-specific expectations. A prudent approach now often pairs FID divided by KID with task-aligned evaluations, ablation studies, and human judgments where relevant. In addition, there is growing interest in more nuanced metrics, perceptual similarity under domain constraints, and metrics that probe robustness to distribution shift or downstream task performance. Hybrid modeling remains a fertile ground. VAEs and GANs were once viewed as competing paradigms. Today, adversarial objectives feed into autoencoder frameworks as in VAE GAN and adversarial autoencoders, delivering sharper samples with structured latent spaces. More recently, efforts to blend diffusion-style sampling with adversarial objectives aim to combine the sample fidelity of diffusion models with the efficiency and controllability of GANs. While such hybrids are not a single recipe, they illustrate a trend, leveraging complementary strengths to address core limitations, from expressivity and mode coverage to training stability and inference speed. Looking ahead, researchers are extending conditional and controllable generation, improving cross-domain synthesis, and pursuing scalable, fair, and privacy-preserving GAN systems. We'll also see continued refinement of evaluation protocols and more robust domain-specific baselines to ensure progress translates beyond benchmarks. I welcome your questions and reflections. If you'd like, we can discuss how these advanced strands might apply to your current projects or explore potential collaboration avenues that align with your datasets and constraints.